Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining again for another episode of the Ending Sexploitation podcast. This week's episode is going to be a little different from usual. We'll be listening in to Dani Pinter from the NCOSE Law Center as she interviews three experts, one tech expert and two lawyers, who are going to be talking about the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA for short. You've probably heard us reference this bill in past episodes, but there's a lot of misinformation out there about what this bill is, what it does, and what it doesn't do. So this is going to be a great chance for us to dig deeper. So we'll listen in and hope you enjoy.
All right, good afternoon. I am Dani Pinter, Director of NCOSE's Law Center. We are here today to talk about the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA, the most comprehensive child protection legislation in nearly 25 years. There's a lot of misinformation circulating on Capitol Hill regarding KOSA, mainly because big tech has infinite money to oppose any effort to tell them they need to make safer products. I'm joined by two experienced lawyers who will cut through the fog and explain what KOSA is and why it matters. And then we will go to our tech expert, McKenna, founder of Protect Young Eyes. Professor Mary Graw is a tenured professor at Catholic University, a former federal and state prosecutor with special expertise on child sexual abuse, child sex trafficking, and technology-facilitated trafficking. Ben Bull started NCOSE's Law Center after having built the famous legal program at Alliance Defending Freedom over the course of many years. Ben is a First Amendment expert and a seasoned litigator. Both Mary and Ben have major credentials to discuss this topic. Ben and Mary, welcome. Professor Graw, over to you.
I think before we get into discussing the nuts and bolts of KOSA, I wanted to bookend a little bit with you all the history here and to give it context. And I want to do that not because I'm a professor and I just like history, but I think it would be very helpful for you in understanding how it is that Congress has ended up with this kind of legislation for this issue. And really, the history is one of deception. It's one of deception on Capitol Hill, and it's one of deception with regard to what's happening in courthouses across the country. First, let's talk about Capitol Hill. According to NCOSE, there have been approximately 41 hearings touching on child protection with a variety of different topics. At them, big tech executives or surrogates have testified at approximately 11 of them, and at approximately 3 of them, we've had a series of whistleblowers. Despite all this hard work by Congress, a final child protection legislation has not made it through the House. But I want to talk about the deception. What have your bosses, what have the people on the Hill been told by big tech in these hearings? And essentially, what they have done is created a picture that tech is really trying to fix these problems, that all of these problems that our kids are experiencing are sort of just collateral damage to what the ecosystem of the internet is about. And I've put some examples up here for you. This first page, this first one from Mark Zuckerberg was to the House, where they were talking about removing content, and they're talking about how child exploitation probably doesn't even happen on Twitter. And then we've got the global head of safety saying they're constantly improving safety and that children under 13 are absolutely not on Facebook or Instagram, and they're immediately taken off. And then Instagram saying that they are going to continue to invest more than anyone else in this space. Keep in mind these promises when we get later. Since then, what have we learned? Is this true what tech's been telling your bosses? Well, whistleblowers tell us no. As far back as 2021, you'll remember the testimony of Francie Haugen, where she painted a very clear picture of tech leaderships being told the damages that their products were causing, and they refused to make any changes. We saw again in 2023 repeated examples of the same thing, where the safety people are letting Meta know there are problems and they are not doing anything. And then, as recently as just a few weeks ago, has anything changed? It appears not. In fact, it may have gotten worse with the most recent hearing with whistleblowers, talking about Meta being aware of harm that they have created and burying the evidence, or talking about putting out fake features that they know are insufficient and then claim that that's proof that they're taking action. And I think it's important to note that this is what tech is doing after that very famous hearing in the Senate where Mark Zuckerberg was forced to apologize to parents. And you'll remember a full-throated commitment to protect kids. But if you don't like the hearings, what else do we know to see if what tech's been saying is true? Well, the media's done a lot of investigation, and here are just some highlights. 40% of children under 13, 40% of children under 13 are on Facebook or Instagram. There have been internal documents where Instagram is boasting how it's penetrating the 11 to 12-year-old population. So very different than what your boss has heard at hearings. There have also been investigations. The Colorado Attorney General did a significant investigation and found not only that the internet is a primary vehicle for drug transactions, but social media platforms in particular. And then through litigation, we've seen some other documents come to light with repeated information where leadership's been told about design problems and they have ignored that in favor of engagement and profit. And then we just know it from their own actions. So this year alone, according to Wired, this is what's happened to trust and safety at these major companies, with Google even removing from their website a pledge promising not to pursue tech that will, quote, cause overall harm. And remember what they promised. They promised that they will continue to invest and that the internet will be made safe by their actions. So, what do we know? We know that your bosses have been told one thing on the Hill, and the reality is something entirely different. And unfortunately, the same is true in America's courts. Many of you know about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is a very narrow Good Samaritan provision in the law, which is meant to protect from liability websites that remove indecent material from their websites. But throughout the courts of this country, they have gone into these courtrooms and have argued for something very different and have achieved almost absolute immunity for any decision they make. And if you don't believe me, please believe Justice Thomas, who's referred to what they have done as a, quote, get out of jail free card, where they take the position and have convinced many judges that any decision they make is met with immunity from liability, something that no other industry has in America. And if that's not clear enough for you, this is taken from the transcript of one of these litigations where counsel for TikTok was asked, are you really arguing that you don't have a duty to design a platform in a safe way? And counsel said, yes. I do want to argue that, Your Honor. So it's as clear as day. That's the position that they are taking in court. Very different than what they are saying to the public and very different than what they are saying to your bosses. So that's a little bit of history about how Congress ends up taking this angle to try to have some safety in this space. They can't amend Section 230 for the points that Dani mentioned. There's so much money that seems to be opposing that. So Congress, literally looking at the bodies piling up in front of them from their constituents, has decided to act in this way, to go at design and a duty of care. So I'm going to focus on that. But before I get into what it does, let's be clear what it doesn't. It does not have anything to do with speech, okay? And importantly, the liability created for platforms is not if a child is harmed, because they might not be able to control that. It's not if this bad material gets to the child. It doesn't even prevent a child from searching for this bad material. In fact, this statute is so much the floor of what a company should do. It doesn't even make it illegal for them to design features that are designed to encourage the frequency of time spent for minors. All it does is say, if you do that, and it focuses on these design features, okay? It says, we're going to even allow you to have features that encourage youth to spend time on your platform. But when you do it, all we're asking you to do is use reasonable care when you're designing them to prevent certain harms and foreseeable harms. The very floor of what we expect every industry in America to do. That is it. And the list of harms is something that is not controversial. Eating disorders, physical violence, narcotics distribution, things of that nature. So all the duty of care says is when you are designing your products that are designed to have youth stay on your product, use reasonable care to not cause these harms. And you're only going to be liable, not if the harms are caused, but if you haven't used reasonable care. I can't emphasize enough, and my colleague Ben will talk much more at length about the First Amendment, but the bill explicitly has language, okay? Explicitly has language removing any concerns about the First Amendment, and it explicitly has language that says nothing in this bill will prevent anyone from getting information they are actively seeking. It just prevents them from being fed the information when they didn't actively seek it. So it's not about speech, and it is about actions. And I just want to give you the other bookend about history here. You might be wondering, where is this speech argument coming from then, if it's really not about speech? And I would encourage you to look at the well-documented media coverage of this, which outlines explicitly that big tech lobbyists are the source of this speech argument. And these are relatively conservative to center media outlets that have reported directly on this as an issue. So that is not coming from academia, really. It's coming from industry. I just want to point out a couple other ways in which this is really a watered down legislation. You should be aware that tech has raised a concern that if attorneys generals were able to enforce this duty of care, that would somehow be unfair to them. Again, most industries do face such liability. So that's been taken out of the act. And now only the FTC can enforce this particular provision of the act. And I think that that's really important. So you're going to get a lot of pressure on the Hill for all these problems with KOSA and the duty of care, and there's going to be suggestions to water it down a little bit more. I would just encourage you to not water it down anymore. It has been written to really represent, in my view, the floor of what is expected of companies. The reason you're going to get this pressure is laid out right here. The under 18 population makes about $11 billion for these companies, and they have spent last year, by some accounts, over $90 million to fight child protection bills. That's where this is coming from. That is the climate that you are in. And frankly, if the duty of care is not part of this Kids Online Safety Act, this real minimum, just saying just be careful when you design it, then I wouldn't recommend passing the bill at all. And the reason is because then we'll have exactly what that whistleblower warned us about, an appearance of doing something, but in fact, children and children's parents are still in danger. So those are my thoughts on the duty of care, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Graw. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Dani. Thank you, Professor Graw. I come at this issue from kind of a different perspective. I spent more than 30 years making a living challenging the constitutionality of federal and state and local legislation. So I know a little bit about the constitutionality of provisions, and I can smell legislation when it doesn't pass constitutional muster. And I'm confident, 100% confident that this bill, the KOSA, the current iteration of it would pass constitutional muster. Early iterations, early drafts of the bill were criticized by some in the religious liberty community as potentially being used to censor or discriminate against content and viewpoint. That language has been cured, and the recommendations submitted to Congress by several religious liberty organizations were incorporated into the bill. Right now, the bill can't be used to restrict any viewpoints at all. By virtue of the language in the bill, it doesn't apply as a matter of law, as a matter of federal law, to any speech protected by the First Amendment. That's pretty huge. And you talk about carte blanche guarantee that it won't be used for unconstitutional purposes. That's about as strong as it gets. And then I've heard the argument that what about a rogue bureaucrat that wants to engage in mischief and use this to advance his or her own agenda to censor the speech on the political left or the political right, and so on and so forth. Again, the language was cured and fixed, and the bill cannot be used, KOSA today, and the language that's operative today can't be used to advance that kind of mischief, can't be used to advance any kind of viewpoint-based discrimination. Now, relating to content, it's important that everyone understands that there is no content that's censored by the bill. Any child or any parent, for that matter, can obtain any content they want. What it does do is empower parents for the very first time to turn off predatory algorithms that we all know who have children or grandchildren, that it's like candy or catnip for cats. They can't stop eating it. They can't get away from their devices. And this is done intentionally by the police platforms. They know exactly what to do to hook kids. They do it. And Mary mentioned CDA 230. I'll mention this as well, not to digress too much away from content-based discrimination, which this bill does not do. But right now, there is no incentive for these online platforms to consider the health or welfare of children in any way, shape, or form because of CDA 230, which gives the platforms carte blanche protection, immunity from suit for any harms that they cause children. In a case that Dani, Pinter, and I have been working on for a couple of years against X, they're in their legal briefing, and we have a copy of this if you're interested in seeing it. They argue that to the court that they can act in coordination with sex traffickers who put CSAM, child porn images, on its platform that are sex trafficked, monetize it, and they're completely immune from any responsibility or liability when they do that. And they know they're doing it, and they continue to do it. But their position is, come and get us if you want. You can't because of our get out of jail free card called CDA 230. Well, for the first time, this will force the online platforms to consider the health of children in their algorithms and in their notifications and in their communications with child users. For the very first time, first and only time, as far as I can see, this will be a factor along with the profit motive in designing algorithms and designing their apps. There's also an important provision, I think Mary touched on a little bit, that for the first time, the platforms will be required to pull back the curtain and show how they use algorithms, how their algorithms and recommendations work. Right now, it's a big secret. We do have whistleblowers, which, capture the moment, and the moment passes and nothing happens. Well, KOSA will require these online platforms to explain just how they use devices like algorithms to hook and keep children online hour after hour, day after day, and also, what measures they're taking to comply with the duty of care requirement in KOSA. Again, for the first time in federal law, federal or state law, there'll be a law that requires them to consider duty of care and injury to the child in designing their features. Again, they did away completely with the notion that subjective injury or hurt feelings can form the basis of any sort of cause of action. As a matter of fact, the bill does not allow individual litigants to litigate in enforcing KOSA. It empowers the FTC to enforce it. It allows state attorneys general to enforce it, but nobody else, which is fairly narrow. And that's, again, these online platforms that are engaging right now in pernicious activity, knowingly pernicious, hurting children, hurting adults. They have no incentive because they're untouchable right now. Well, for the first time, this will allow them not to be untouchable. And with that, I will, at the end, perhaps we can answer some questions, but I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Chris McKenna, who probably knows more about the mechanical workings of online platforms than anybody on the planet.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Dani. I think it's important to step back for just a minute and maybe talk a little bit about some of the harms that are present, because unless we understand what's really going on inside of these applications, I don't know that we maybe have the right mindset and motivation around why we need to cure these problems. And Professor Graw and Ben have done an excellent job of explaining what language is there, what the history is, and really what we're aiming for. But I spend a lot in the world in Protect Young Eyes with the kids themselves, right? So I see these harms. And so these aren't just words in legislation. We can't forget that we are preventing real world harms to young people with what Professor Graw said is the basic minimum here. We all know technically the capabilities and the genius that is inside of these companies. Look at the technology that they've designed. And I think it's worth pointing out in terms of some of the history technically, is when you look back at the hearings, particularly the hearings where a CEO or a tech leader is testifying. I remember some of the language from Senator Blackburn, who's just such a warrior on these issues, where like a thief in the night, technical solutions are rolled out at midnight or early in the morning before one of these tech CEOs is testifying. So we know that they know how to cure these harms, and we know that they have the technical capability to do that. So to step back for just a minute, when you look at some of the research, 2/3 of parents say that their children have experienced harm when it comes to using social media. The Surgeon General published a report saying that 95% of children 13 to 15 use social media, and the effects are that those who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes. The numbers around some of this are, I'm sure, statistics that we've all read and heard in the news, that half of teens have experienced cyberbullying, according to Pew Research, that there are developmental windows that we must be careful of where we see increased harm when children are inside of social media. And we have to remember that technically not all young people, when it comes to the complexity of the controls that have been rolled out, have caregivers in their lives who have the technical know-how in order to enable or find certain settings in the first place. So technically what KOSA does at a very high level is it takes technical ability and puts it into 4 categories of solutions. You have safety measures, which are some of the items that Professor Graw already went into, some of the content that we know should never be promoted to young people. Again, a distinction. Could they search but not promoted, related to suicide, eating disorders, patterns that indicate addiction-like behavior, promotions of narcotic drugs, tobacco products, etc. So that category of the safety measures. Number 2, design limitations. We know that when it comes to designing features that prey specifically on some of the vulnerabilities of young people and their desire to be connected with their friends, or their desire to be connected to as many friends as possible, that the features have endless genius in terms of how they can do that. What KOSA does is says, listen, design features reasonably with these developmental knowledge that we have with young people in mind. It's that reasonable care, that bottom minimum. Number three, parental tools. And to me, this one is really important because we spend so much time at Protect Young Eyes just helping parents do things that should be obvious. My organization shouldn't even need to exist. These should be tools that parents by default know how to use, can find, and are on automatically. We shouldn't have to search for privacy if you're 14. Privacy should be the default feature. We should have to go and search for exploitation. We shouldn't have to search for privacy and protection. And unfortunately, that's the situation we have today. And KOSA aims to cure that by default strongest privacy settings for young people. And we know that they can do that. And then finally, Ben just referred to this algorithm transparency. And in each of these four, I can give more examples of what can be done. But these four categories are basic technical capabilities, feasibility that could be done. I sometimes joke these are changes that could be made over breakfast. When I talk to others in the tech space, CEOs who have bought and sold tech companies, and I put a piece of legislation like KOSA in front of them, they look at me and say, Chris, there are difficult things technically to do in the technical world, in the software world. These are not some of those things. These are all changes that can be made. We know that because they design in the other direction already. We know that they can design without some of these technical features in order to protect kids.
Thank you so much, Chris. So what I love about KOSA, I have, I think, a question for each of you, and I'll start with Mary. But what I love about KOSA is it's building on principles that already exist in the law. So we have products liability law, this reasonable care, this duty of care exists in every other industry, and tech has skirted away from it with Section 230. And Mary, if you just build on, I feel like there's fear mongering that this is going to open the floodgates to frivolous litigation, but you touched on it. This duty of care is really just a baseline for the FTC to do what it already does, which is consumer protection in other contexts, right?
You're exactly right, and I'm glad that you made that point. This is all fitting under this legislation or the standards at the FTC that already exist. So all it's simply doing, you could say in a layman's description, is making it abundantly clear that tech, like everybody else, fits under these provisions. So I think that that's exactly right. As well as we haven't seen a quote unquote flood of litigation in that other in the currently existing provisions that the FTC has. So the idea that we will all of a sudden see that seems to be false. And if I could take a minute to point out, Danny, if we look at it historically, every time there's any tweak to the law, that's exactly what we are told. If we go all the way back to 1996, tech said that Section 230 was going to destroy the internet and it was going to open up this litigation. Never happened. Then we've had a couple of tweaks in the law over the years, some having to do with trafficking, some having to do with Section 230, some having to do with advertising, if you remember the SAVE Act. Every time they tell us the same two or three things will happen, that there will be massive litigation that will bankrupt them, that the internet will break, we'll lose our competitive advantage, and more recently, that there's going to be some problem with speech. And yet, that has never occurred to the level at all that they suggest.
Thank you so much, Mary. And then Ben, I want to talk with you a little bit about the importance of parental rights and how it plays in this bill, because I want to just emphasize something that you pointed out, which is that it allows for the first time the option for parents to opt their child out of the recommendation algorithm. And so what that means is that a parent can now, for the first time, choose for their child to just have an organic timeline where it's things are popping up in the chronological order that they appear, and rather than their child being put in sort of the recommendation algorithm based on their data where we know that causes a lot of the really big problems because they're being fed really addictive things and often really harmful things based on their activities. So, parental rights is an important area where that's already established that parents should have a right, and the government does have the ability to allow parents to protect their kids, even where maybe content is involved. So, just hoping you can kind of talk with us about that a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I testify from time to time in state legislatures and even once before Congress. And the argument we hear by big tech is we don't need this regulation. We just need better parental supervision. Well, they asked for it, and now we're giving it to them. We're empowering parents for the very first time with the ability to cut off these harmful algorithms, which the industry knows are designed to hook children, make it impossible for them to take the devices away from them. And anybody with grandchildren or children know that when they see the temper tantrums, it's almost like taking an addictive narcotic away from an addict. And this isn't intentional. It's designed. It's the way the algorithms and notifications are intended to impact these child users. One thing else I've noticed about big tech and especially big tech opponents to this and other legislation, they will come forward with an objection, and then you'll address it and you'll agree to fix it. All they do is move the goalposts. The staffers that are watching this have to understand that they will never agree to this legislation. If it's passed, it'll be passed over their objections. They'll just change the goalpost and come up with something new and something different every time you fix a problem that they raise. I have a little bit of frustration with some critics from the religious liberty community, which gave us a list of 8 things they needed in the bill. And working with Senator Blackburn's office, we did all 8 of them. Still, they wouldn't endorse the bill, which is, again, I'm frustrated by that because, to say that this is somehow going to restrict free speech or somehow it's going to impose, rushing requirements on the internet is kind of like saying that the laws requiring seatbelts or headlights or speed limits are going to interfere catastrophically with driving. Well, we know that these are common sense things. And for the first time, we actually have a common sense statute, this bill that will empower parents and protect children and hold online platforms to some duty of care. And it's not a high standard, not a high burden, just a duty of care where they have to actually consider for the first time in history the impact of their algorithms on children, which they don't have to consider right now.
Thank you, Ben. That's super helpful. And just to build on that, if they can show to the FTC that they were even reasonable, even if kids were harmed, but that they were reasonable in their care, they won't face penalty under this bill. So truly the floor, like Mary said. And I want to kick it to you, Chris. But before I do, I think your comments are really important, Ben, about moving the goalpost. It's important when we think about what the internet and attempts to regulate them in history, like Professor Graw said, what that really means. Because when Congress was moved to do something about Backpage and the enormous, horrendous crime of sex trafficking that Backpage was facilitating in other online platforms, and where we had repeatedly courts of appeals saying they got Section 230 immunity even for knowing facilitation of sex trafficking. Congress did the right thing and passed FOSTA SESTA, but big tech was given the seat at the table to make changes to that bill. And when they made arguments to Congress that, for example, the language conduct underlying the claim needed to be added, or they would face a patchwork of state trafficking standards that are all different, and they wouldn't be able to compete with, to deal with that. They would accidentally trip over different state laws. And so in FOSTA, we needed to make sure that the federal trafficking statute was the standard they needed to follow. Now that sounds really reasonable, but us and advocates and even some members like Marsha Blackburn, her office pointed out that that language could be misinterpreted and could create this really difficult standard where the courts are now expecting plaintiffs to show criminal liability on behalf of the platforms. And the tech companies have done exactly that. They've actually argued against the fact that it was just a standard, that it was a federal trafficking standard. They've gone into court and said, no, that was never the reason that language was added. That language was added because Congress wanted to create a heightened standard for websites, and you have to show criminal liability. So they will tell Congress they need something for these reasonable reasons and then go in court and say the opposite and deny they ever did that, and the courts listen to them. So it is important that we that you stay strong and that we pass this very low standard, this just floor, this beginning of something, and let's see how it does. Let's see it work. Let's see some accountability from the tech industry. And on that point, Chris, if you can explain to our staffers, how difficult, because you mentioned that parents are coming, they're, desperate for help. And to Ben's point, that this is always big text line, hey, parents should be doing this. Can you help us understand how
Sure.
difficult it is for parents to use these parental control features on these platforms and how they constantly change?
Yeah, I want to bring us again back to the child for just a minute. And we have something that has recently happened here in the past few weeks to show us how necessary KOSA is. Dani, I have hundreds of messages from hundreds of parents whose young children, without any searching, without any interest at all, were fed the video of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, like just out of nowhere. And so technically, what we have to understand is what, again, is happening right now. Technically, the algorithm has a number of different facets, which we've never really had the ability to do anything about. If you're in the app, it's sort of this binary, this is what you get. And so KOSA will change this. There's user-centric algorithmic recommendations. So just simply based on the fact that, say, I'm a 16-year-old boy, it's going to feed me certain things, even if I've never looked at those things. It's trying to predict my interests. One story was this 16-year-old. He said, scrolling on my phone, one of the first videos I saw was a cute dog, but then it took a turn. He said, out of nowhere, I was recommended videos of someone being hit by a car, a monologue from an influencer sharing misogynistic views, and clips of violent fights. And he asked himself why. Like, this is never content he had ever looked at, but because of his age and had been profiled by the algorithm, this is what he was fed. So just based on that sort of profiling, content that does well, even if it's nothing I've ever looked at, if somewhere else in the social media platform I'm on, something did well, it's going to show that to people who aren't following that account in order to get that creator more followers, just based on what's popular, what people are clicking on. So it's this kind of potential for harm, simply based on the algorithm being designed a certain way, that parents will finally have the ability to opt out of personalized recommendation systems, right? To be able to limit categories of recommendations. And for the youngest users, for parents to be able to lock these things in. Again, some KOSA says needs to be by default. Privacy settings need to be their most private for youngest users by default. Parents will not have to search anymore. Parents will not have to go 30 steps deep. They should have to go 30 steps deep to turn it off. And that's what KOSA is saying will be the reality. So these are the sort, again, of common sense. Like, let's get back to the tweens and the teens and the children. Let's get back to the families. Common sense, shouldn't it be that we should have to hunt for our children to be harmed instead of the other way around to keep them safe? Right now, the algorithm essentially hunts for them to show them what is harmful because that's engagement. That is the exact opposite of reasonable care. And given that they can design the algorithm that way, technically it is easy to undesign, or that's not a word, but you know what I mean, to design it a different way toward the benefit of children in a very reasonable way. So those are some of the things I think are just really important that we've had like happen recently. And sometimes I get the pushback, it's parents' job. We need parents to do a better job. Okay, we have just at the end of September, Arturo Bahar did testing with other organizations of 53 different safety features that had been released in Instagram. That Instagram said, hey, look at all that we're doing. Parents just enable these things. And they found that 2/3 of those safety features either didn't work or no longer were present. They didn't even exist anymore in the platform. So we have to legislate even the simple controls that parents have the ability to use that they're saying are present. It's all smoke and mirrors. This is why we need this bill.
Thank you, Chris. And parents are not at the cutting edge of technology. Tech knows what parental controls are going to work on their own platforms as their products change. And they are constantly innovating and changing, and the parental controls should move along in tandem with that and just be defaulted to the safety setting for kids, because parents aren't going to know about a new feature till it's too late, right? And of course, tech is going to get away with doing the least amount that they can without any kind, if unless they have this duty of care responsibility. And also, Chris, I mean, just the one thing I wanted to highlight too, whenever tech says it's on the parents, that's leaving behind our most vulnerable population of kids who often don't have an active and involved parent, yet they almost always have a device. And we can't just leave that group of children behind and shrug it off as if they don't matter. So if tech's gonna profit from them, they should keep them safe. So that ends our presentation. Thank you to my panelists. As discussed, now parents and families will have the ability to access justice for their children due to KOSA, and KOSA is about conduct, not content. So let's get Kids Online Safety Act past this session. Children cannot wait one more day, let alone another session, for vital protections on these dangerous platforms. Congress must reject big tech's cynical misinformation campaign and protect our kids over profits. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for listening in. As always, we will have links in the show notes for you to learn more and to take action. Right now, it's a very important time for you to send a message to your legislators asking them to support the Kids Online Safety Act. The government is shut down right now, but now is a good time to get your voice heard. Send that email, because we need Congress to know that as soon as they get back to work, kids' safety online has to be their number one priority. It's time to stop putting it on the back burner, and feel free to send them this episode as well if you feel like it helps make the case. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us in Ending Sexploitation.